Okay, so next we have the participation constraints. So these are constraints. When we say a participation constraints, so these are constraints that determine whether kada member ng superclass must participate as a member of a subclass. So a participation constraint may be mandatory or optional. So take note of these keywords, mandatory, optional. So we will be using that, these two. You know, in this anyway, we have examples naman to illustrate this definition. So a subclass or superclass relationship with mandatory participation specifies that each member in the superclass must also be a member of a subclass. No? So, take note yung subclass at superclass na relationship na mandatory yung relationship. No? You represent this with by writing a mandatory. No? And you placed it in a curly bracket below the triangle that points towards the superclass. So for example, in this figure, no, etong ano na to, itong full-time, permanent, and part-time. We have here mandatory. Wait, kalimutan ko pala. Eto, yeah, this one. So in this figure, the contract of employment, no, is a mandatory participation, no, in which means that every member of staff must have a contract of employment, no, diba? Or we're going to, where's that? Yan, okay. So basically what it means, no, itong mandatory, no, means that every member of staff must have a mandatory contract. No? Kasi itong full-time, permanent, part-time. Para, di ba? There are two types of contracts ba sa isang staff. Could be you're a regular na employee na or part-time, temporary. So yun, you could either have, you should have you must have, no, a contract. So that's why mandatory na a certain superclass should also be a member of this subclass. Now, on the other hand, no, a superclass subclass relationship with optional participation specifies that a member of a superclass needs not to belong to any of its subclass. So for an optional participation, we're going to represent optional. So yeah, ito to. And it's placed in a curly bracket below the triangle that points towards the superclass. So same with this one, but instead na optional yung ginamit dito. Now, for example, in this figure, the job role, no, specific ito sila, these are job roles, has a optional participation, no, in which a member of staff need not have a additional job role, ba? So every member of staff, no, here, no, sa superclass, need not to have an additional role, no. In other words, optional lang yung participation ng sa member of a superclass sa mga subclasses na to. Yeah. It's because obviously na you can just be a regular staff, no? Or it's possible you can optionally you can also be a manager, a salesperson, or a secretary. Kaya optional yung ano dito nakalagay. Again, this is what ibig sabihin nito is optional participation of the superclasses sa mga subclass dito. Whereas this one is mandatory na mga members of this staff, no, must be, no, a member also of this subclasses. Okay. So this is for participation constraint pa lang. Itong first part of the constraint. So meron siyang another one here. Itong and tsaka or. This is what we call the disjoint constraint. Okay? So when we say disjoint constraint, these are constraints that describe the relationship between members of the subclasses and indicates whether it is possible for a member of a superclass to be a member of one or more than one subclass. Anyway, kung if it seems confusing, we'll have an illustration for this one. The disjoint constraint only applies when a superclass has more than one subclass. So these constraints only applicable if a certain superclass has many, more than one subclass niya. So going back to the example again here, if the subclasses are disjoint, then an entity occurrence can be a member of only one of the subclasses. And to represent such instance na disjoint siya, so maglalagay tayo ng or next to the participation constraint within the curly brackets. So for example, in this figure na ito naman, pointing out to this one, to or, the subclasses of the contract of employment, specialization, generalization is disjoint. So which means that a member of staff must have a full-time permanent or a part-time temporary contract, but not both. Okay, you can either be a full-time or a part-time temporary, but not both. Which is in the real world, it would be absurd naman. It's absurd. It's weird. It's weird if you can be both a full-time and part-time. Which is hindi. So on the other hand, ito yung may and naman na disjoint constraint. So if subclasses of specialization, generalization are not disjoint, let's say these are non-disjoint, then an entity occurrence may be a member of more than one subclass. So it's possible that a member of a superclass can join multiple subclasses. Unlike here, that a member of a superclass can only join only one of these subclasses. Okay, so to represent this kind of relationship, we write the and, placed next to the participation constraint within the curly bracket. So for example, in this figure, ito naman sa left side, the job roles, specialization, generalization, ito sila tatlo na to, is non-disjoint, kasi yun nga, may end yung nakalagay dito. So which means that an entity occurrence of staff can be a member of both manager, salesperson, and secretary. Okay, so here are just to emphasize again what I mentioned, every member of staff must either be full-time permanent or part-time temporary, but not both. Hindi pwede. Whereas on this side here, a member of staff can be both manager and salesperson. It's possible. So yun yung ibig kong sabihin nga, member of a superclass can join more than one subclasses. So we have another example here of disjoint constraint, pero walang disjoint constraint na nakalagay. It's because the manager, the salesperson, and secretary, they only have one subclass. So as you ma-recall pa natin, that this disjoint constraint is only applicable for scenario where kung maraming subclasses yung isang superclass. But since isa lang yung subclass niya, ito isa lang yung subclass niya, kaya we only have participation constraint lang present. Walang disjoint constraint. So yun. Yeah. So we have other examples. We're just going to explain lang what's going on here. So we have a staff superclass, no, that has the following subclasses: supervisor and manager. And as you notice also, the staff superclass has a relationship with the branch, no? And its subclasses, supervisor, also has a relationship, no, with its medyo unique to because this one has a relationship with its superclass, no? And also with this one, itong subclass na manager has a relationship with another entity, no? And if we're going to read this one here and we're going to interpret this constraint here, we have participation and disjoint constraint. So what this means is staff may not be optional lang na maging supervisor siya or manager, no? It's not required na pag staff ka dapat supervisor ka na or manager ka na, no? And for here the disjoint constraint so which means pag staff ka and if you want to be promoted to a higher position, you can either be a supervisor or manager, but not both. Yeah. So let's have another example. So here we have the owner as the superclass, and its subclasses are the following: private owner and business owner. So this time we have a mandatory participation constraint, which means an owner should be a private owner or business owner, no? But since we have here the or, so which means an owner can either be a private owner or a business owner, but not both. And then the last example here, so this one is, we have the following: person superclass that has the following subclasses: staff, private owner, and client. So mandatory, no? So which means a person entity should be a staff, private owner, client, but since we have this joint constraint here, or, so you can either be a staff, private owner, or client, but not both. Yun. Then as for this staff, ito namang staff na subclass, no, as also it has its own subclasses, no? So this staff here has the supervisor subclass and manager subclass, and then we have here optional, so which means a staff can either be may or may not be become a supervisor or manager. Pwede lang staff lang siya, no? Kasi optional lang man yung participation ng superclass to its subclasses, no? Then we have or, so which means if you're going to be promoted, you can either be a supervisor or manager. Now as you notice, no, this supervisor, wala siyang entity attribute, no? Perhaps it's just to emphasize that a staff, no, when being promoted, should have dalawa lang yung yung pwede niyang ma-promote na position, the supervisor at manager. Now, since as mentioned, no, subclasses inherit the attributes of its subclasses a superclass, no. So take note, no, since supervisor is a subclass of a staff, so automatic na yan, no, automatic na nga ito, it inherits the attributes for the staff. So yung supervisor meron nitong position at salary. Now of course, staff is also a subclass of the person superclass. So we can say that this staff also has inherited the number and name attributes for this staff na entity. So therefore we can say itong supervisor na to has a total of 4 attributes in which they were inherited from the staff and person superclasses. Okay, so that ends our lesson for this about enhanced entity relationship models. So there are actually other concepts that I need to discuss, but let's just cut it here since they are less relevant. So we need to discuss this one because this may be applicable pohon soon if you're going to create your own entity relationship in which could perhaps that spot you're going to apply a subclass superclass relationships in your entities. Okay, so that ends the video, and thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next videos. Goodbye.